I'm Lichko, and I'm an undergraduate physics major here at the University of Michigan. And this summer I spent 10 weeks at Santa Fe Institute working on, I guess, what I would call a computational anthropology project. So it's a little bit of a change. And my project focuses on the processes that shape cultural diversity. So when we usually talk about cultures, we talk about big groups of people. So Jewish culture, Asian American culture, Polish culture, that kind of thing. Groups of people that share customs or like a common language. But when we look at the anthropological definition of culture, anthropology defines culture as interactions or information transferred between individuals. So a mother teaching a daughter how to weave rugs, or friends teaching each other how to play a game. And somehow these individual interactions lead to these big macro-level cultures that we see. And so my project over the summer was looking at how these individual interactions lead to these big macro-level cultures. I kind of alluded to these before when I was talking about individual interactions. There are several main processes of individual transmission that govern the individual interactions. There's vertical transmission, or transmission from parents to child, like a mother. It would be your parent, your mother, or your father teaching you how to do something. Then there's horizontal transmission, or peer-to-peer transmission. So that would be someone your age. It could be even a cousin or a friend you're not related to who teaches you something. And then there's oblique transmission, or learning of traits from mentors. So that could even be an aunt or an unrelated older adult who teaches you a different trait, like how to weave in a certain way, or like reading, anything like that. And there's a lot of discussion about how these different interactions affect cultural diversity. And these names that I have up here have a lot of different theories of how they affect cultural diversity. So one of the main theories is that vertical transmission, traits that you get from your parents, are a lot more conservative. They don't really change as much. So vertical transmission leads a lot more to like intra-culture diversity, as opposed to horizontal transmission, where traits can change a lot more rapidly, and it leads to a lot more intercultural transmission. And there's been a lot of studies and research in this area, but most of them have been in with real people, in the standard anthropological studies, where people go and they live with the tribe and they talk to them. Say they live with a group of Iranian basket weavers, and they talk to the women in the group and they ask them who taught them the different types of transmission, how to weave in a certain way, who taught them to use ram's horn ornament 1 versus ram's horn ornament 2, and that's how they look for evidence as to which mode of transmission is producing a certain type of diversity. But what they haven't done really is to look at it from a computational standpoint, to write a computer simulation where you've got fake agents, or computer simulated agents, running around and transmitting traits. And that's what I did over my project in the summer. So I'm going to take a little step back, and is there any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to tell you about phylogenetics, which are the analytics techniques that are used to see which modes of transmission are kind of going on and how they affect cultural diversity. And then I'm going to talk about the simulation that I did over the summer. It's an agent-based model of population dynamics, effectively. And then show you some very preliminary results from my 10 weeks, and then talk about where we're going next. So phylogenetics is a group of analytic techniques that anthropologists kind of borrowed from biology. And as you can see here, the main thing in phylogenetics is the phylogenetic tree. And it's kind of like a family tree. But instead of showing how closely related my cousin and I are, it shows how closely related different species are, or in terms of anthropology, how closely related different cultures are. A little bit of vocabulary. The lowest intersection right here is called the root, and all these intermediate intersections are called nodes. The segments are called branches, and everywhere you see a monkey, it's called a tip. And there's also a temporal component, as you can see by the arrow over there. So this is kind of a record of how the different cultures or species split off from each other as time went on. Okay. So there used to be a phylogenetic tree here, which I'm going to draw out. Okay. So basically, this. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we use phylogenetics to look at the different transmission modes. So one of the important concepts here is phylogenetic signal, which is how the extent to which the tree that we have, say right here, explains the traits that we see. So to what extent we can explain it purely by vertical transmission, and to what extent that there are some other factors like horizontal transmission or oblique transmission coming in and that are dominating the transmission of that trait. So a example of a measure of this is something called Pagel's lambda. So Pagel's lambda of 1, which you can see right here, is a measure of very high phylogenetic signal. So basically, vertical transmission explains everything. There's a little bit of random mutation, but basically the tree is the dominant process. And there's also Pagel's lambda equals 0, which means that the tree explains nothing. That there's some other dominant transmission process like horizontal transmission or oblique transmission that's explaining this, the trait distributions that we see. Okay.
Just real quick on that. So if you have lambda of 0, does that mean that similarity, if you have lambda of 1, that means that you are closest to the people who are your nearby neighbors in the tree?
Correct.
And 0 means that it's mixed at random.
Right, exactly. They're all equally related, basically, as far as if the tree goes.
Mm-hmm.
Like the tree doesn't assist in any way in explaining the trait distributions. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So now that you know my research question and the kind of techniques that I used, I'm going to talk a little bit about my simulation that I used and then analyzed with the phylogenetic signal. So I started out with a group of 25 agents, which are the red dots, on a blue background, which is absolutely nothing, it's just background. And so that was my initial setup. And then as time went on, each time step being 10 years, agents were born, agents died. As agents got older, they had a much higher probability of dying. And to the point at which I think at 50 or 60, all agents were pretty much dead. Or agents did not live past the age of 50 or 60. And agents reproduced between the ages of 10 and 30, or like 1 and 3 time steps, basically. And it was asexual reproduction, so anyone could be a mother. And offspring were reproduced by a Poisson distribution of average 2. And so there could be hypothetically 0 children that a mother produced during a certain time step. So after a couple iterations of birth and death, the population eventually reached a certain size where it split into 2 populations. So I chose size-dependent splitting because it is fairly standard in the field, but it's definitely an area that I'd like to expand on in future iterations of the model. Like say the yellow group likes their toes better side up, and the red group likes their toes better side down, and they obviously can't live together, so they split off into 2 different groups and move away. And then eventually, after they split into 2 different groups, time goes on, and they split into more groups, and eventually my simulation looks like this, where I have a bunch of groups distributed over this landscape. And the different colors correspond to different groups. And I know a lot of the colors look kind of similar. That's just MATLAB. Every clump you see is a different group. So while they're doing all this reproduction and splitting and moving, the most important thing that they're doing is transmitting traits between each other. And there are 2 different kind of categories of transmission that I set up in this model. There's localized transmission, which in poor choice of name called transmission, and there's kind of long-distance transmission, which I called immigration. And in the transmission set, I guess, it's something that happens every time step for all agents. And agents transmit within their group, and they transmit traits with groups that are very close to them, very close around them. And immigration is much rarer. It happens to a very small set of agents every time step, and it's physical immigration, like physically moving to another group, like, for example, intermarrying into another group.
Like switching between, or,
yeah.
or just one?
One person moving.
Oh, not the other one going.
No, it would be, say, like you get married to someone in another country and you move over to that country. So it'd be something like that. But yeah. And then there's also transmission to groups that are further away. So for example, someone over here transmitting with a group over here that normally wouldn't be within their like interaction distance, their sight distance. And that's more like trade, for example. And okay. So any questions about my simulation before I talk about my result? Okay, cool. So this is a histogram of Pegel's lambda for a simulation run with a very, very low transmission rates. And I don't know if you can see the legend from that far back, but the blue traits are purely vertically transmitted traits. The green traits are purely horizontally transmitted traits, and the red traits are purely obliquely transmitted traits. And we could see at this point that they all have a very high Pegel's lambda, which is what we would expect, because they're all vertical transmission is kind of the dominant process because they're not interacting very much. So there's not that horizontal or oblique presence. So effectively, these are all vertically transmitted traits, with a little bit of noise for the horizontal and oblique. And then here I have a simulation run with a very high transmission. It's again a histogram of Pegel's lambda. And as you can see, the vertical transmission, the blue, has a very high Pegel's lambda of 1, whereas the horizontal and oblique, because there's such a high rate of transmission, has a Pegel's lambda of nothing very distinctive. Which would seem to support that the tree doesn't really explain anything and that there is horizontal and vertical and oblique transmission going on.
Just a quick check. So these are frequencies? So
sorry, these are for multiple.
You run the simulation 500 times and this is how they work out?
Exactly, yeah. And so this is the work of 10 weeks. So there are a lot of things I'd like to do to expand the model. I'd like to make different modes of transmission more prevalent in different parts of the life cycle, which is something that we think happens in real life. Like children do a lot more vertical transmission, whereas like older people do a lot more horizontal transmission. Looking at things like conformity and prestige bias, like copying people who are very successful. Looking at adaptive versus neutral traits. All the traits that I've talked about right now are neutral, so they don't confer any sort of advantage to people who have them. Whereas eventually what I'd like to do is make the environment variable. So when you're in the top right-hand corner, trait A is really good, whereas when you're in the bottom right-hand corner, trait A like kills you. Looking at something like that and seeing how that changes the histograms and the trait distributions. And also looking at real data sets and comparing how the trait distributions match up with my model. And so to thank my mentors and the NSF and the Planning Institute, and you all for listening. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Any questions? Cool.
So this is kind of my stock question for a lot of agent-based models.
Yeah.
What role does space play? So you put agents on a grid. How does that fit into the theory?
It fits in because it determines how, in real, I guess, life, the groups who are closer to each other are closer related to each other typically, and so my model reflects that, and that when you split apart, you move apart, but not too far apart. So in that sense, the spatial component plays a role. I still need to test and see if it's really making a big difference in the final histograms by stopping them from moving, but I just haven't done that yet.
You can imagine that the